As the Victorian age drew to a close at the end of the 19th century, the feminist movement gained momentum, as evidenced by the New Woman. These feminists resisted being placed into specific domestic roles. According to Eileen Cipher, this New Woman challenged earlier Victorian notions about the sanctity of marriage, the appropriate sphere of women's work, and women's shyness about sexuality. As society adjusted to these new philosophies promoted by suffragists, literature reflected the conflict of traditionalist viewpoints and the dawning of modernism. Modernism focused on science and self-consciousness, rejecting the romantic values of the past and questioning the axioms of religion and conventions that had sustained British civilizations for centuries. Combining emergent modernism with feminist ideology altered the status of women and specifically affected the role of the mother. No longer was she naturally the selfless, altruistic, hardworking manager of the hearth. Her motivation shifted to individuality, self-achievement, self-interest, and the right to refuse or postpone marriage and family. Lois Kukulu asserts in her book, Expert Modernism, Modernist Matricide and Modern Culture, that this motivation results in the demise of the mother figure in literature. Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent, was written as the ideologies of the Victorian age and modernism clashed in a culture adjusting to new technologies and philosophies. The novel, set in 1886 in London, is about a man named Verloc who plays the role of an ineffectual revolutionary, mostly acting out his political theories through meetings with fellow revolutionaries and writing up pamphlets. At one point, he's threatened with the loss of his financial backing if he doesn't perform a more violent act of terrorism. Through a series of events, his attempts to bomb the Greenwich Observatory are foiled when his wife's brother Stevie trips with the bomb and is killed. This causes Verloc's wife, Winnie, to transform from a simple, passive housewife to a hysterical murderess. Verloc is killed, and Winnie seeks aid from one of Verloc's revolutionary companions, Ossipon, who betrays her, taking all her money and abandoning her to the elements of the city. So now you know a little summary of how the book works and who the main characters are. So though Conrad wrote as modernism philosophies were challenging the traditional roles of women, he was raised within the Polish romantic tradition, which exemplified women, especially mothers. The character Winnie Verloc symbolizes this conflict between the opposing views of women. In his author's note, written 12 years after the novel was published, Conrad explains that the story of the secret agent is really Winnie's story, not so much Verloc's. It is her maternal passions that inspired the story. For some critics, like Eileen Cipher, Winnie is the pivot. With that in mind, a study of her place within the novel reveals a damning critique of the New Woman and of a changing society that altered the roles of women and for mothers played in their community. Conrad writes each of his anarchists in the story to have a new woman attached to him. Carl Jung is nursed by a bleared-eyed woman. Michaelis is supported by a rich patroness, and Ossipon, a medical school dropout, is sure to want for nothing as long as there were silly girls with saving bank books in the world. These new women served as foils to the seemingly proper Winnie. In contrast to them, Winnie is completely dependent on her husband Verloc. Winnie's first mentioned in the novel when Verloc returns home after being told he must bomb the Greenwich Observatory. She realizes that her husband has returned but does not greet him. Instead, she returns to her duties in the kitchen until it's time for dinner. The reader's first impression of Winnie is that of a servile, detached, passive Victorian wife. Richard Curley describes her as having all the conventions and reticences of her class, combined with what can only call a rare sense of abnegation, and was loyal a wife to the unattractive Verloc as she was a devoted daughter and sister to her two helpless relatives. Winnie seemed to personify the feminine perspective, described by Susan Brody as one of suffering humanity, an image in which the self matters primarily as an instrument of service to others. And she does suffer in order to serve for others. She gave up the possibility of marriage to a man she loved because he could not afford to take care of both her brother, Stevie, and her mother. She sacrificed bearing a child to ensure that Verloc, her husband, never redirected any paternal affections he might have felt for Stevie, her brother, to his own biological child. And this suffering and sacrifice seem to symbolize the traditional woman. On the surface, Winnie is a passive character, determining not to allow herself to fall into the idleness of barren speculation. She's rather confirmed in her belief that things did not stand being looked into. She remains ignorant of her husband's political machinations because the proper Victorian wife should be, according to Lloyd Finrando, in New Women in the late Victorian novel, excluded from every kind of political activity in order that they might the better wear an aspect remote enough to seem worthy of worship. But Winnie's passivity is, in truth, an active passiveness. She chooses to be ignorant of the world in which she is encased. She chooses to reject the attentions of the butcher's son and instead marries Verloc rather than actively pursuing love. She chooses not to bear Verloc's children. She chooses to perform all the maternal duties instead of requiring that Stevie's actual mother do her job. Following Victorian expectations is, for Winnie, the simplest thing to do. This passivity, this self-sacrifice for the good of others, is a front, however. Winnie's selfily operating in her marriage against the expected natural order. The theme of anarchy can represent the elimination of the boundaries of Victorian expectations. Of all the anarchists in the novel, Michaelis, Karl Jung, Ossipon, even Verloc, not one actually performs any damaging revolutionary activities. These secret agents are well known by the local authorities, who have very little apprehension regarding their activities. It's Winnie who's the true secret agent. She was mysterious, capable of a bargain, the mere suspicion of which would have been infinitely shocking to Mr. Verloc's idea of love. She's the one character who is effective in her furtive activities. On the surface, Winnie seems to be a noble figure, but the language and imagery Conrad uses portrays instead a prostitute. At one point, Conrad describes Winnie's bedroom rituals as businesslike, bringing to mind the mercenary tone of a professional woman. She marries Verloc for financial support and stability for her mother and brother. When she feels that Stevie's reputation with Verloc is somehow threatened, she transforms from the servile mistress of the house to a seductive goddess. In their marital bedroom, she hung over him with cheeks tinged a faint dusky flush, and gleaming eyes looking much more animated. She was confident of the power of her charms to keep him in line. When she feels that he's on the verge of abandoning her, she performs her most seductive act, transitioning from the passive noble creature that Conrad had initially created to a temptress. She turned her head over her shoulder and gave that man planted heavily in front of the fireplace a glance, half arch, half cruel, out of her large eyes, a glance of which the Winnie of the Belgravian mansion days would have been incapable because of her respectability and her ignorance. But the man was her husband now, and she was no longer ignorant. She kept it on him for a whole second with her grave face motionless like a mask, while she said playfully, "You couldn't. You would miss me too much." It's ironic that she no longer felt ignorant. That knowledge, reminiscent of the knowledge Eve gained when partaking of the fruit in Eden, transforms her into an overt seductress, performing in order to control her spouse. Her secret agenda is exposed to the readers, and a questioning of her integrity begins. Winnie is childless, but Conrad presents her performing maternal duties and expressing maternal emotions towards Stevie, even though his biological mother is living in the same house. In Winnie's first scene, she instructed him to wash his hands and face, and the peremptory tone she had used in that connection for 15 years or so, ever since she had, in fact, ceased to attend to the boy's hands and face herself. As if this isn't enough to place Winnie in the role of mother to the boy, Conrad goes even further, giving her the fierce protectiveness that would be expected from the actual mother. She could not bear to see the boy hurt. It maddened her. As a little girl, she often faced with blazing eyes the irascible licensed victualler in defense of her brother. Here are two prongs in maternal affection: the domestic loving but mundane caring for a child, and the ferocious protectiveness a mother feels when her child is threatened. For Conrad, this characterization of Winnie as a mother figure is vital because, as Cypher states, in The Secret Agent, he openly confronts the most powerful of females for the male, the mother. He discovers she is at once the source of all life and the source of all destruction. In order to do this, he has to make Winnie an aberration to society, a degenerate. For in actuality, Winnie is not a mother. She is a mother substitute who refuses to reproduce naturally, rejecting true motherhood when she makes a certain resolution not to bear a child of her lot. This is the degeneracy of the new woman that Conrad critiques by making Winnie into a murderess. When Winnie receives the news that her husband is responsible for her brother's death, she assumes a physical resemblance of her brother, who is described by another character as a degenerate. The droop of the lower lip, even the slight divergence of the eyes. Later, when Winnie clings to Ossipon as a rescuing hero, she is again likened to Stevie, the degenerate by Ossipon's standards. He was excessively terrified at her, the sister of the degenerate, a degenerate herself of a murdering type. By assuming autonomy over her reproductive system, Winnie is denying her womanhood, thereby making herself a degenerate. Cesare Lombroso outlines the degenerate woman in his book Female Offender, and Winnie follows the outline meticulously. In the aftermath of her murderous actions, Winnie descends into a state of madness, at one point described as hysterical. One symptom of hysteria, as described by Lombroso, is a mobility of mood. Winnie goes from adopting that easy attitude immediately after she stabs Verloc to feeling anguish and shame, and then loneliness, deteriorating even further into repressed violence, and then alternating between rage, bitterness, triumph, relief, gratitude, desperation, listlessness, franticness, and eventually settling into a subdued composure before breaking down in sobs. Another symptom of hysteria, as described by Lombroso, is a fixation to certain ideas to which they stick with a kind of cataleptic intensity. Winnie portrays this cataleptic intensity in the idea of dying at the gallows and the repetitive refrain, "The drop was given, was 14 feet over and over and over." Erotic behavior is another indicator of the historical criminal, according to Lombroso. Winnie metamorphosizes from faithful wife to lascivious woman on the street when she says to Ossipon, "I'll work for you, I'll slave for you, I'll love you, I won't ask you to marry me." Flight is another. First, she flees the house with no goal in mind other than leaving the scene of her crime. She determines that suicide is her best option, which is another trait of hysteria, but then fixes on the idea of escape, where she realizes that murderers escape. They escape abroad. Conrad follows the outline set by Lombroso to characterize Winnie as a criminal, specifically the hysterical degenerate. Besides the idea of degeneracy, as a woman, Winnie is automatically an other in the binary of the patriarchal society. Using light and dark imagery, Conrad draws upon the other, creating a binary of good versus evil. Before the murder, when Winnie is written as the noble, virtuous Victorian wife, she's described surrounded by whiteness. The light thrown down by the shade fell dazzling on the white pillow sunk by the white weight of her head, reposed with closed eyes and dark hair. And, again, her white form. And her big eyes stared wide open, inert and dark against the snowy whiteness of the linen. It's interesting, however, that even in the white imagery surrounding Winnie, there is darkness in her dark hair and her eyes, representing her secret rebellion, the conscious refusal to bear children for Verloc that abides within her heart. When Winnie determines that she's now a free woman, no longer bound to Verloc because of his betrayal, Conrad's use of black imagery to showcase her fall from grace becomes more prevalent, beginning with the blackness of his wife's eyes that disturbed his optimism, and the tying of a black veil over her face. After the murder, dark imagery is consistently connected with Winnie, associating her with the primeval darkness and engulfing space of London itself, as Rebecca Stott says in her article. Her black veil is mentioned repeatedly. Her face is masked, casting her all black from head to foot. She fled her home, a symbol of the domestic Victorian woman, and entered the black street, devolving into one of the degenerate women of the night. Conrad is even more clear about this transformation when he describes Winnie and Ossipon as they walk along the London streets. The dark forms of the man and woman glided slowly, arm in arm, along the walls with a lover-like and homeless aspect in that miserable night. Here again, the author uses the device of the home to illustrate how this Winnie, as a lover and a free woman, a new woman, no longer belongs there. Instead, she is sunk in a hopeless night, resting at the bottom of the black abyss. Eventually, Winnie, last seen clothed in black by several witnesses, disappears, shrouded in an impenetrable mystery. By using white and black imagery, Conrad depicts the decaying transformation Winnie experiences from the proper Victorian wife to the new woman, from life to death. The home and the domestic matron is purified by light and whiteness. Now, the mother is the source of all life. Conrad shows that Winnie is an aberration of motherhood by causing her to be the source of destruction. First, she proudly tries to fabricate a son for Verloc, inadvertently causing Stevie's death when she turns him over to a false father who uses Stevie as a means to transport his deadly wrong. More dramatic, however, is her murderous rage against Verloc when she finds out that Stevie has been killed. At this point, all vestiges of nurturing motherhood vanish from Winnie's persona. While previously Conrad seems to suggest that the fierce protectiveness is simply another attribute of maternity, he's now unwilling to reconcile that rage in Winnie. Because she's not a true mother, he does not allow her the emotions a mother would feel at losing her child. Instead, he blatantly creates a social reprobate. Winnie's final scenes in the story show her no longer as the caring but passive maternal figure. When she flees her home in terror, instead of a woman in need of aid, she represents a trap that Osinpan must escape when he becomes embroiled in her flight. His arms pinned to his side by a convulsive hug, while the cold lips of a woman move creepily on his very ear. The coldness of her lips showed that she's already dead to Conrad. He saw the woman twined around him like a snake, not to be shaken off. She was deadly. She was death itself, the companion of life. The break-in of tradition is the deadly sin here. No longer is she Eve, transformed by knowledge. She's now the serpent, the devil itself. By her actions, Winnie has desecrated the unbroken, reserved decency of her home. Her punishment is to deny her any existence. She was nowhere. She was gone. She's now completely dehumanized, without form or place. The Secret Agent is a tale of anarchy, a revolution against the social order. The character of Winnie Verloc represents the rebellion against the Victorian domestic. Conrad judges Winnie for the crime of resisting social norms, for assuming a power in her marriage and over her body that rightfully belonged to her husband, by describing her as a woman that devolves into moral and mental degradation. When the wife and mother aspire to liberation and autonomy, the domestic is compromised and a decay of the home begins from within. Conrad portrays the moral ruin that will occur when one resists the social constraints that are necessary for civilized existence. There's no hope for the new woman. Ellen Harrington puts it succinctly when she states, "No satisfying life exists for Winnie outside the traditional confines of home, husband, and child/brother. Her identity is entirely defined by her association with them. Her doom mocks the idea that a liberated woman can function on her own. With the tragic destruction of all that she loved and needed to survive, Conrad shows how the new woman annihilates the civilization that has sought to protect her by placing her within a sphere of tradition." Thank you.